What if I told you that one of Britain's most powerful politicians, after a conversation with a homeless man he met on a cold winter night, made one of the most important decisions of his life, and this decision changed the lives of millions of people? Watch this incredible story to the end, because what happened at the end fundamentally changed Britain's social policies. That cold December night in London, the clock showed 23:30. Snowflakes were slowly falling to the ground, covering the city's streets with a thin layer of white. The temperature had dropped to 3 degrees Celsius, making it one of the coldest nights of the year. Keir Starmer, emerging from a grueling 8-hour meeting at Westminster, was walking home with tired steps through the nearly empty streets of central London. The meeting had been particularly intense. Labour Party strategists, polling experts, and senior MPs had gathered to discuss their approach to the upcoming general election. The Conservative government was struggling with multiple crises: economic uncertainty, NHS waiting lists, and rising inequality. But despite these opportunities, Labour's polling numbers weren't as strong as they should be. Some argued they needed more populist policies. Others insisted on maintaining their progressive values. Starmer had spent hours that day mediating between different factions within his party, his head filled with complex political calculations, voter demographics, and strategic scenarios. The weight of leadership felt particularly heavy that night. Every decision he made would affect millions of people. Yet sometimes he felt disconnected from the very people he was supposed to represent.
As he walked through the deserted streets of Westminster, past the imposing government buildings and monuments to British power, Starmer's mind was racing with tomorrow's challenges. He had 3 media interviews scheduled, a meeting with trade union leaders, and a crucial vote in Parliament on social housing funding. The irony of that last item would soon become starkly apparent. Starmer's route home took him through some of London's most contrasting neighbourhoods, from the seat of political power in Westminster through the gentrified areas near the Thames to the more working-class communities where he lived. He preferred walking when possible. It helped him think, and, he believed, kept him connected to ordinary life. However, as he passed through the narrow street near Waterloo Bridge, an area he knew well from his days as a young barrister, he noticed something that made him stop dead in his tracks. At first glance, it appeared to be just discarded rubbish, a pile of old blankets, cardboard, and plastic bags pressed against the brick wall of a Victorian building. But then he heard it, a weak, persistent coughing that immediately told him someone was struggling to survive beneath that makeshift shelter. The sight that greeted him when he looked closer was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. An elderly man, probably in his late 60s, was huddled under layers of threadbare blankets and newspapers, trying desperately to conserve body heat in the brutal cold. His clothing was a patchwork of charity shop finds and street survival gear, a torn winter coat that had seen better decades, multiple layers of jumpers with holes, and most disturbingly, only one shoe. His left foot was wrapped in plastic bags and old newspaper, a makeshift protection against the freezing pavement. What struck Starmer most was not just the man's obvious physical distress, but his dignity. Despite his desperate circumstances, he had arranged his few possessions neatly around him: a small stack of books wrapped in plastic, a cup for donations placed precisely at arm's reach, and even a small battery-powered radio that was quietly playing classical music. This wasn't someone who had given up on civilization. This was someone civilization had given up on. Starmer felt an immediate internal conflict. His rational, political mind reminded him of his schedule, his security concerns, and the potential complications of getting involved. But his human instincts, shaped by his working-class upbringing and years as a human rights lawyer, wouldn't let him walk past. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the man. "Excuse me," he said gently, "are you all right? Do you need help?" The elderly man raised his head with considerable effort. Starmer could see that despite the ravages of street life, the weathered skin, the unkempt beard, the clothes that hung loosely on his thin frame, there was intelligence and dignity in his eyes. More surprisingly, when the man spoke, his accent was educated, almost refined. "I'm managing, thank you," the man replied, his voice hoarse from cold and what sounded like a chest infection. "Just trying to keep warm. Not much choice on a night like this." Starmer crouched down, bringing himself to the man's eye level. "What's your name?" "Robert Mitchell," the man replied, extending a grimy but steady hand. "And you are?" "Keir Starmer." As soon as he said it, Starmer wondered if he should have given a false name, but something about Robert's demeanor suggested that honesty was the right approach. Robert's eyebrows raised slightly. "Starmer. That's an interesting name. Scottish heritage?" "Yes, my father's side. You have a good ear for accents." "Occupational hazard. Or was, anyway. I used to teach linguistics and mathematics. Spent 30 years in comprehensive schools around London."
This revelation hit Starmer like a physical blow. Here was a man with decades of public service, someone who had dedicated his life to educating children, now reduced to fighting for survival on the streets. It challenged every assumption Starmer might have had about homelessness being limited to those who had never contributed to society. 30 years teaching? Starmer asked, settling more comfortably onto the cold pavement beside Robert. That's remarkable. Which schools? Robert's eyes lit up slightly at the genuine interest. Started at Hackney Comprehensive in the 80s, moved to a school in Salwork in the 90s, finished my career at Academy in Tower Hamlets. Saw a lot of changes in education over those years. What did you teach specifically? Mathematics primarily, but I had qualifications in physics and economics too. I loved teaching the kids who struggled with numbers, helping them see that maths wasn't their enemy. Robert's voice grew stronger as he talked about his work. I used to tell them that mathematics was just another language and everyone could learn to speak it if they found the right teacher. Starmer was fascinated. So what happened? How did you end up here? Robert's expression darkened and he was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Life has a way of testing you in ways you never expect, Keir. He told Starmer about Margaret, his wife of 38 years. She had been a nurse at Guy's Hospital, dedicated to helping others, just as he had been dedicated to teaching. They had met at a Labour Party meeting in 1975, young idealists who believed they could change the world through public service. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2018, Robert continued, his voice thick with emotion. The NHS was wonderful, truly, but the waiting lists for specialist treatment were getting longer. We had a little savings, and I took early retirement to care for her and pay for private consultations when the delays became unbearable.
Starmer listened intently as Robert described the agonizing 3-year battle that followed. The experimental treatments, the false hopes, the gradual depletion of their life savings. They sold their modest house in South London to pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. When Margaret died in 2021, Robert found himself not only devastated by grief, but also financially ruined. The school had offered me a position back after Margaret's funeral, Robert explained, but I was in no state to teach. Depression, they call it now. In my day, we just called it being broken. I couldn't focus, couldn't remember things. Lost the job within 6 months. Without income and having sold their home, Robert had moved into a series of temporary accommodations, bed and breakfasts that charged exorbitant weekly rates, housing associations with years-long waiting lists, friends' sofas that quickly wore out their welcome. Each step had taken him further from the middle-class life he had known. The benefit system, Robert shook his head. It's not designed for people like me. I had savings once, so I didn't qualify for housing benefit, but those savings were long gone. The bureaucracy is Byzantine, forms that ask questions about circumstances that stopped being relevant months ago. Interviews that require you to prove you're actively seeking work when no one will hire a 68-year-old former teacher with no permanent address. Starmer felt a growing sense of anger, not at Robert, but at the system that had failed him so comprehensively. "How long have you been on the streets?" 2 years and 4 months, Robert replied with painful precision. "You mark time differently out here, not by calendars or clocks, but by seasons, by which doorways provide shelter from rain, by which times of day the soup kitchens open."
The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Robert described the daily reality of homelessness, with an eloquence that came from his teaching background and a brutal honesty that came from his circumstances. He spoke about the loss of dignity that came with being invisible to most of society, about the physical toll of sleeping rough, about the mental health challenges of social isolation. "People assume we're all drug addicts or alcoholics," Robert said. "Some are, of course, but most of us are just people who fell through the cracks. I don't drink, can't afford it, and I've never touched drugs. But I understand why some people do. When you have nothing left to lose, sometimes numbness seems preferable to feeling everything." Starmer found himself profoundly moved by Robert's story, but also intellectually engaged. Here was someone who could articulate the flaws in Britain's social safety net with the insight of someone who had experienced them firsthand, combined with the analytical skills of an educator who understood systems and structures. "Robert," Starmer said finally, "if you were designing a better system to help people in your situation, what would it look like?" Robert's response was immediate and detailed, suggesting he had given this considerable thought. "First, you'd eliminate the gaps between different types of support. Currently, if you're not quite homeless enough for emergency housing, but too homeless for regular housing benefit, you fall into a void. Second, you'd treat mental health as an integral part of the solution, not an afterthought. Grief, depression, addiction, they're not character flaws, they're medical conditions that need treatment." He continued with increasing passion. "Third, you'd recognize that being homeless doesn't eliminate someone's skills or value to society. I'm still a mathematics teacher, I just don't have a classroom. There are probably engineers, nurses, accountants, all sorts of professionals living rough. Use those skills. Fourth, make the bureaucracy human. When someone is in crisis, they shouldn't have to navigate a maze of forms and appointments and eligibility criteria. One person, one assessment, immediate support."
Starmer was taking mental notes of everything Robert said. This wasn't just abstract policy discussion, this was real-world intelligence from someone who understood both the problem and potential solutions. As they talked, other homeless people began to approach. Word had spread through the informal network that someone was having a real conversation with Robert, not just dropping coins and hurrying away. First came Sandra, a woman in her 50s who had been evicted when her landlord decided to sell her flat to property developers. Then Marcus, a former soldier whose PTSD had cost him his job and eventually his family. Each had a story that challenged stereotypes about homelessness. Sandra spoke about working 2 minimum-wage jobs, but still not earning enough to afford London rents after her housing benefit was cut. Marcus described the difficulty of accessing mental health services when you don't have a permanent address to receive appointments. A young man named Danny explained how aging out of care at 18 had left him with no family support and insufficient life skills to navigate housing applications. What struck Starmer most was how articulate and insightful these individuals were. They weren't passive victims, but people with clear ideas about how to improve their circumstances, if only the systems existed to support them. They had formed their own informal community, sharing resources and looking out for each other in ways that formal services failed to do. The temperature was continuing to drop, and Starmer realized he had been sitting on the cold pavement for nearly 2 hours. His expensive coat and warm clothing had protected him, but he could see that Robert and the others were genuinely suffering from the cold. Standing up, Starmer pulled out his wallet. He had about £150 in cash, money he typically carried for emergencies or convenience. Without hesitation, he distributed it among the group, giving Robert the largest share. "Please,"
he said as Robert started to protest. "Use this to get somewhere warm tonight. All of you."
Robert's eyes filled with tears. "Keir, I don't know how to thank you, not just for the money, but for listening, for seeing us as people." "Robert, I should be thanking you. You've taught me more in 2 hours than I learned in 2 years of policy meetings." As Starmer finally headed home, his mind was racing with everything he had heard. The stories, the insights, the human faces behind abstract statistics. It had all combined to create a profound shift in his understanding. When he arrived home, Victoria was waiting up for him, concerned by his late arrival and the fact that his phone had been going straight to voicemail. "Keir, where have you been? I was about to call the police." Starmer sat down heavily at their kitchen table and told Victoria everything. He described Robert's story, the other people he had met, the insights into policy failures that he had gained. Victoria listened with growing amazement. "My God, Keir, what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I know I can't just go back to business as usual. I can't sit in meetings talking about homelessness statistics when I've just spent 2 hours with people who are living those statistics." That night, Starmer couldn't sleep. He sat at his computer, researching homelessness data with a new urgency. The numbers were staggering. Over 300,000 people experiencing homelessness across the UK, including 62,000 sleeping rough. But more importantly, he began to understand the human stories behind those numbers. He called his chief of staff at 6 a.m. "Michael, clear my schedule for this morning. I need to prepare a major policy announcement." "What kind of announcement, sir?"
"We're going to solve homelessness, or at least we're going to try." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Starmer assembled a team of policy experts, but insisted that any meetings include voices from people with lived experience of homelessness. He arranged for Robert and several others from that night to participate in policy discussions, treating them as experts rather than charity cases. The announcement came a week later at a press conference held not in Westminster, but at a homeless shelter in South London. Starmer stood beside Robert as he outlined the Home for All campaign, a comprehensive approach to ending rough sleeping within 5 years. The policy had several key components: immediate emergency accommodation available within 4 hours of request, mental health support integrated into all housing services, employment programs that recognized existing skills, and a simplified bureaucracy that treated people in crisis with dignity rather than suspicion. But the most revolutionary aspect was the funding mechanism. Instead of relying solely on government resources, Starmer proposed a national crowdfunding campaign that would allow ordinary citizens to directly support homeless services in their communities. "This isn't about charity," Starmer explained to the assembled media. "This is about justice, about recognizing that in one of the world's wealthiest countries, no one should be forced to choose between shelter and dignity." The media response was immediate and largely positive, but the real validation came from social media, where #RobertMitchell began trending within hours. People shared their own stories of homelessness, near homelessness, and encounters with rough sleepers. The #WeAreAllRobert followed, with thousands of people expressing solidarity. Within 48 hours, the crowdfunding campaign had raised over £2 million. Individual donations ranged from £5 to £50,000, each accompanied by personal messages of support. Comments included, "For my brother who died on the streets while waiting for housing," "because it could be any of us," "in memory of all the teachers who shaped my life."
The first Starmer house opened in Robert's original neighborhood 6 months later. It wasn't just emergency accommodation, but a comprehensive center offering job training, mental health support, and permanent housing placement services. Robert was hired as the center's first education coordinator, developing literacy and numeracy programs for residents. The model proved so successful that within a year, similar centers had opened in 15 cities across Britain. Each was funded through a combination of the national crowdfunding campaign, local government support, and private donations from businesses and individuals inspired by the initiative. But perhaps the most significant impact was on public attitudes toward homelessness. The campaign had humanized an issue that had previously been seen as intractable. People began to understand that homelessness wasn't a personal failing, but a systems failure that could affect anyone. A year after that fateful December night, Starmer and Robert met again at the exact spot where they had first encountered each other. Robert was no longer living on the streets, but in a small but comfortable flat near the Starmer House Center where he worked. He had reconnected with former students, many of whom had reached out after seeing news coverage of his story. "Keir," Robert said, as they stood together in the spot where they had first met. "That night changed both our lives, didn't it?" "It did," Starmer agreed. "I thought I understood poverty and inequality from reading reports and meeting with experts, but I needed to meet you to understand the human reality behind the statistics. And I thought my useful life was over, that I had nothing left to contribute to society. You contributed more in one conversation than most people do in a lifetime. You taught me what real leadership looks like."
2 years later, rough sleeping in Britain had decreased by 40%. The Home for All campaign had become a model studied by governments worldwide. Robert Mitchell had been awarded an MBE for his services to education and homelessness advocacy. But for Starmer, the most important change was personal. He had learned that effective leadership required not just political skill, but human connection. That the best policies came not from think tanks, but from listening to people who lived the problems those policies were meant to solve. In his memoir, published several years later, Starmer would write, "I met Robert Mitchell on the coldest night of the year, but that conversation warmed my understanding of what it means to serve others. He reminded me that behind every statistic is a human story, and behind every policy should be a human heart." The final chapter of that memoir was titled "The Teacher on the Street Corner," and it concluded, "Robert taught me that we are all one crisis away from needing help and all one conversation away from offering it. The measure of a society is not how it treats its most successful members, but how it cares for those who have fallen." That December night, I learned that lesson from the best teacher I ever had. This story shows us that sometimes life's greatest transformations arise from the most unexpected encounters. Keir Starmer thought he was just helping one person that night, but actually he was learning to be the leader Britain needed. And Robert Mitchell became not just someone who received help, but someone whose wisdom and dignity taught an entire nation about the true meaning of community and compassion.